I had precisely one request to do a video about this palette, and honestly, that's all it takes. So this video is for you, Angela, Jelly Rouge, and anyone else who's curious about the Viseart Petite Shimmer Koi palette. As of right now, the tail end of June, this is still available on the Viseart website and a few other retailers. However, I do know this is limited edition, so depending on when you watch this, it may or may not still be available. I will link everything below where I can find it available for purchase. This contains 12 shimmer shades. They contain 1 gram of product, so they are very tiny. I'm going to show you a comparison of what it looks like next to my hand and my phone, which is an iPhone 10, just for size reference. I know a lot of my regular viewers are indie makeup lovers, so I want to preface by saying these are not going to be comparable to the sparkly, shifty, high impact shades that you would find from an independent makeup brand. Think of these as more of like watercolors. They're a very soft, ethereal wash of color. They have an iridescence to them and a slight duochrome flip, but they're not going to be that bam in your face pigment type of eyeshadow that you have seen featured in some of my other videos. Also, I do want to give a shout out to Chloe Enchanted. You should subscribe to her YouTube channel and follow her on Instagram. She totally put this palette on my radar. She's done so many beautiful looks with it and she talks about it all the time. 100% is the reason why I wanted to have this palette in my collection, and I'm so glad I do. Also, I guess I should plug myself. Hi, if you're new to my channel, I'm Riley. I love sparkly, shifty eyeshadow. I occasionally review new products, but more often than not, I like to take deep dives into my existing collection and take an analytical approach to reviewing it. Also, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps me out a lot. Either way, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start by showing you the full palette swatch so you can see the color story as a unit. I swatched this on my arm. I did 1 or 2 swipes depending on how opaque the shade was. I did not use any primer, just on my dry arm, and I used my finger to swatch it. So here's what it looks like in indoor lighting. I did have my ring light on off to the side. I was able to catch some direct sunlight, so I wanted to film swatches outdoors, and I did let it go slightly out of focus so you can see the sparkles, which I think is where you really see the magic of this palette. So here it is up close and slightly out of focus. So now that I've shown you the color story as a whole, I'm going to go over each individual shade. Kokai is described as a dandelion yellow with a shimmering metallic finish. I did more of a diffuse swatch because I do think this is the best representation of the effect you get from these eyeshadows. I didn't put any primer or anything on the back of my hand, so this I would say is a pretty middle of the road primary yellow. Doesn't really lean too warm or cool. It's more of a satin finish in my opinion, but there are these individual flecks of yellow sparkle throughout it. It's very smooth, but it is on the drier side. You can apply it with a brush for a more sheer wash of color. If you tap it on with your finger, it will be more opaque. Here I tapped it on with my finger and diffused the edges with a brush. Pond is described as an aquamarine seafoam with a shimmering metallic finish. This is my absolute favorite eyeshadow in the palette. It's very hard to capture the effect this eyeshadow gives on camera, but it creates this lit from within, radiant mermaid iridescence. My favorite way to use this is just to put like a very subtle neutral color in my crease. Then I will tap this all over my lid, and then at the very most convex point of my eyelid, I'll tap on a tiny bit of a sparkly topper shade, and it just creates this like ethereal mermaid complex yet subtle vibe, which I absolutely love. Koi is described as an iced melon with a gold duochromatic flip. I would call this a mid-tone orange, maybe slightly coral leaning, and it has that same texture and finish as Kokai, which we went over earlier. And the main difference besides the color is that duochromatic flip. It's not a strong flip, it's more so just when you hit the right lighting you do see that flash of gold. As you can see, I'm applying all of these the same way in that I'm tapping them on with my finger and diffusing the edge with a brush because I think that's the best way to see the color on the eye. Gin is described as an iced violet with a silver duochromatic flip. I would say is more of the opposite. I see it as more of a very, very pale silvery blue with a purple flip, which is very hard to pick up on camera. I actually thought this was the same shade as the shade Wink in the Violette Étendue palette. I'm going to try to remember to put a little comparison in here, but they are indistinguishable to me. So just something to be aware of if you do have that palette. This is another one of my favorites to use in that same way that I use Pond. I'll put a wash of a neutral color on my lid, a wash of gin all over my eye, and then tap a sparkly shade just on the very center of my eyelid. Creates that same ethereal effect. Sakura is described as a cherry blossom vermilion with an iced shimmer metallic finish. This to me reads like a punchy, saturated coral. It's definitely the most dry, but also opaque shade in this palette, in my opinion. Another thing to note about it is there are quite a bit of multi-dimensional sparkles throughout it, which may not show up on camera just because they are so finely milled and small. I do see a slight gold duochromatic flip in here. I'm using an extra brush here to diffuse the edges just because it is a bit more opaque and saturated than the other shades. It did blend easily along the edges. Tokyo is described as a pale iced gold with a shimmering metallic finish. This reads to me as a slightly gold leaning champagne. It feels the most creamy out of all the shades in this palette. It has a reflective metallic finish, but then it also has those individual flecks of sparkle throughout it. This is one that I grew to appreciate more with time. At first I was like, oh, this is boring, like a champagne shade that every palette has, but it does have some nuance and dimension to it that you don't see in your average everyday palette. I also can appreciate that it really rounds out the palette, so it's not a full-on colorful palette. You can kind of reel a look in by using this if you feel like it has gotten too colorful. Midori is described as a sprout green gold with a shimmering metallic finish. I would describe this as an olive green with a gold flip to it. And I'd say what it's mostly serving you is a sheeny metallic finish. There are some very finely milled sparkles spread out through it, but they are not as pronounced as we've seen in some of these previous shades. I have a pretty pronounced olive undertone, so I almost feel like this reads as more of a straight up gold on me, but depending on your skin undertone, you may see a lot more of that green presence. Murasaki is described as an iced purple with a gold metallic finish. I consider this a pretty true grape purple, and I do see the ever so slightest gold flip to it. Definitely going to need to really be facing a light source to catch that. Finish and texture reminds me a lot of Sakura, which I showed you earlier with the more vibrant punchy coral shade. It has a ton of finely milled sparkles mixed in throughout it, like a high concentration of them. The most prominent color that I see is hot pink, so that's not going to contrast as much against that purple base as, for example, in Sakura the sparkles are gold, silver, and a few other colors. So it just creates more of a dimensional finish within that purple pink realm, if that makes sense. Taiko is described as a white purple pink with a duochromatic finish. This is a true iridescent, meaning that it appears white in the pan, and any source of color that you are seeing from it is due to refraction and interference of light in those particles, like the pigment contained in those particles. This does shift from purple to pink, and there is a strong presence of finely milled blue sparkle. One thing I did notice about this is that it feels quite emollient in the pan. I know most people would use this as like an inner corner shade, but if you have hooded or oily lids, I would hesitate to use this as an all over lid shade. You may get creasing from it. Kamakura is described as a seafoam green blue with a gold duochromatic finish. Yeah, I would describe this as a mid-tone mint green with a pretty prominent gold flip. It's not one of the ones where you really need to be in front of a strong light source to be able to see it. It's pretty right out there on the forefront. This is one of the creamier feeling shades in the palette, and I'd say what it's serving you most is, again, more of a metallic sheen. I wouldn't go so far as to call it metallic, I guess, more of a reflective sheen. This can be easily applied as a more sheer wash of color, or you can layer it on or apply with a more dense brush or your finger for an opaque finish. Lotus is described as an iced lilac with a duochromatic finish. This to me reads like a cool tone pale lavender, and it has a ton of blue finely milled sparkles spread throughout it. I don't see too much of a duochromatic flip, but I do think it's pretty dimensional. And here I have one of those repper brush hairs shed onto my eye. Once again, I do not like these brushes. Anyway, this is one that I really enjoy using. It kind of reminds me of the reverse of Gin, where Gin is an icy blue with purple flip and sparkles. This is a purple with icy blue, I guess slightly flip and a lot of sparkle. Finally, the last shade in this palette is called Yamabuki. It's a peach with a green to gold duochromatic finish. This is one of my favorites in the palette. I just think it's so easy to use. On my skin tone, it pretty much melts into the skin when I put it on my eye, but then you see that slight green to gold flip. I would say it's giving more of a satin sheen without too many pronounced sparkles throughout it. So it's a perfect effortless if you just want to add a little bit of sheen to your eyelid, or if you want to use it as a base and maybe put a topper on top of it. Definitely very versatile, which is why I keep using it all the time. So that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Like I said, it really does help me out a lot. I will link the palette below, like I said, with all the retailers I can find it available at. Some of them may be affiliate links, meaning I would earn a small commission if you purchase it through that link. Of course, if you're not comfortable with that, just search on Google for the website. Please subscribe to my channel if you're not already, but other than that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.